Tonight we're going to drift through the rings of Saturn. These rings are a momentary cosmic coincidence, not a primordial feature of the solar system. Expectation, a permanent crown of ice that has adorned the golden giant since its birth. Reality, a fragile, vanishing veil that may be younger than the dinosaurs. Picture yourself suspended in the absolute silence of the outer solar system, where the light of the sun is a distant, pale memory. You are floating just above the ring plane, and as you look across the horizon, the scale is impossible to process. To your left and right, a river of shimmering silver and gold stretches for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, appearing as a solid, polished floor of ice. But as you drift lower, the illusion breaks. The solid disk dissolves into a chaotic swarm of billions of individual fragments. Some are no larger than a grain of salt, while others are jagged boulders, the size of apartment buildings, all tumbling in a synchronized hypnotic orbit. The air is non-existent, a vacuum so profound that the only thing connecting these trillions of ice crystals is the invisible grip of Saturn's gravity. You can feel the cold, a temperature that does not just chill the skin, but freezes the very concept of motion. The rings are not a single object, but a collection of debris, a ghostly architecture of water ice that reflects the sunlight with a purity that is almost blinding. For a long time, we looked at this site and saw a monument. We believed that when Saturn formed 4.5 billion years ago, these rings were born from the same rotating cloud of gas and dust. It seemed logical that something so massive and so defining would be as old as the planet itself. We mapped them as eternal, treating the rings as a static landmark in the dark, but the universe rarely adheres to our desire for permanence. The numbers do not line up. The purity of the ice is too high, the mass too low, and the orbits too clean for a structure that has survived the violent history of the early solar system. The rings are not a permanent fixture of the cosmos, but a temporary arrangement of matter. They are a fleeting window in time, a cosmic accident that occurred long after the solar system had settled into its current form. We are arriving at Saturn during a brief, lucky interval of deep time, witnessing a crown that is already in the process of falling apart. Every second, particles of ice are being stripped away, drawn down into the planet's atmosphere in a slow, invisible rain of frozen shards. This is the paradox of Saturn. The most iconic structure in our neighborhood is also one of the most ephemeral. It is a shimmering ghost, a remnant of a celestial collision, or a shredded moon that happened while life was still finding its footing on Earth. To look at the rings is to look at a countdown. We are seeing a beauty that is defined by its own disappearance, a fragile veil of ice that will one day vanish entirely, leaving the golden giant naked in the void. This shift in understanding began with the old maps of the solar system. For decades, the scientific consensus regarding the golden giant was settled and certain. The established view held that the rings of Saturn were ancient monuments forged 4.5 billion years ago, during the same chaotic birth that gave rise to the planet itself. This was not a mere guess, but a conclusion supported by the first deep space probes to ever reach the outer solar system. When NASA's Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 swept past Saturn in 1980 and 1981, they returned data that seemed to confirm a primordial origin. The images showed a system of such immense scale and apparent stability that it felt like a permanent fixture of the celestial landscape. Early models based on this Voyager data assumed the rings were static remnants of the original solar nebula. In this framework, the rings were simply the leftovers of the solar system's construction, a disk of gas and dust that had failed to coalesce into a moon, remaining instead as a frozen halo of debris. Scientists believed the rings had simply been there, orbiting in a steady state, surviving the violent collisions and gravitational shifts of the early solar system. This perspective created a sense of timelessness. To the researchers of the 20th century, the rings were as old as the sun, a structural constant that had defined Saturn's identity since the very beginning of time. This belief was comforting because it aligned with the way we perceive the scale of the cosmos. We assume that things of such magnitude must be eternal. We look at the vast, shimmering expanse of the rings, and our intuition tells us that something so large cannot be a recent addition. The early mapping of the ring plane suggested a system in equilibrium, a balanced architecture of ice and rock that had found its final form billions of years ago. The rings were treated as a historical record, a fossilized glimpse into the conditions of the early nebula, but the deeper we looked, the more the evidence began to drift. The assumption of permanence relied on the idea that the rings were a closed system, a static loop of matter. We believed the ice we saw was the same ice that had been there since the dawn of the planet. Yet, as our instruments grew more precise, the purity of that ice became a problem. Space is a dirty place. Over billions of years, cosmic dust and micrometeorites should have darkened the rings, staining the brilliant white ice into a dull charcoal gray. But the rings remained blindingly bright, reflecting sunlight with a clarity that should have been impossible for an object 4 billion years old. The calculations for the mass of the rings also began to shift. If the rings were primordial, their gravitational interaction with the nearby moons should have left a different signature in the orbital dynamics. The rings were too clean, too thin, and far too bright to be the ancient ruins we had imagined. The old maps were not wrong about what the rings looked like, but they were wrong about how long they had been there. The consensus was based on the assumption that the rings were a permanent feature, but the physical evidence started to suggest they were a temporary visitor. But a more recent measurement shattered this timeline. The shift in our understanding did not come from a single photograph, but from the patient analysis of data gathered during the final daring orbits of the Cassini spacecraft. In 2018, a paper led by O'Donoghue and published in the journal Icarus presented a finding that fundamentally rewrote the biography of the Golden Giant. By measuring the mass of the rings and observing how they interact with Saturn's magnetic field, the researchers discovered that the ring system is not a primordial relic from the birth of the solar system. Instead, the evidence suggests the rings are likely only 10 to 100 million years old. This number is a shock to the intuition. In the scale of the cosmos, where the planet itself has existed for 4.5 billion years, 100 million years is a mere blink. It means the rings are essentially new. To place this in a human context, the rings of Saturn likely formed while dinosaurs still walked the Earth. While the first creatures were adapting to the terrestrial landscapes of our own world, a violent event was unfolding in the outer solar system, shredding a moon or capturing a massive comet to create the shimmering veil we see today. If we had arrived in this solar system a billion years earlier, Saturn would have looked like a lonely, featureless sphere of gas, similar to Jupiter. We happen to exist in a brief, shimmering window of cosmic time. We are the first generation of sentient observers to witness this crown, and we may be the last. The rings are not a permanent monument of the deep past, but a temporary arrangement of matter, a fleeting ornament that appeared late in the game. The O'Donoghue study highlights a profound irony of perspective. We looked at the rings and saw an eternal structure because of their sheer size, yet their luminosity and mass betray a youthful origin. The rings are a recent addition to the neighborhood, a cosmic coincidence that provides a stunning backdrop to the night sky, but only for a moment in the life of the galaxy. The purity of the ice, which once seemed like a mystery, is actually a signature of their youth. They have not been exposed to the grinding dust of the void for long enough to lose their brilliance. They are still fresh, still bright, and still falling. This realization transforms the rings from a fossil into a living process. They are not a static record of how the solar system began, but a dynamic example of how it continues to change. We are watching a celestial object in the middle of a transition, a temporary state of grace before the gravity of the planet and the pull of the magnetic fields reclaim the ice. The rings are a ghost of a moon that once was, or the remains of a visitor from the Oort cloud, suspended in a delicate balance that is already beginning to fail. When we look at the rings now, we are not looking at the foundation of a world, but at the debris of a catastrophe, a moon that drifted too close, a comet that ventured too deep. Something was torn apart by the tidal forces of Saturn, scattering billions of tons of ice into a flat, spinning disk. This event happened so recently in geological terms that the system has not yet had time to settle or disappear, and we are seeing the aftermath of a cosmic collision that occurred while the Earth was still a wild reptilian wilderness. The scale of this youth is what makes the rings so fragile. If they were billions of years old, we would have to explain how they survived the chaotic early days of the solar system. But because they are young, we only have to explain the event that created them. The mystery shifts from one of preservation to one of origin. The rings are a temporary bridge between a solid moon and a raining atmosphere. Every piece of ice we observe is a fragment of a story that is still being written. The shimmering bands are not a finished painting, but a sketch in the process of being erased. The sheer luminosity that defines Saturn is a symptom of this transience. The brighter the rings are, the younger they must be. The more beautiful they appear, the closer they are to their eventual end. We have spent centuries assuming that the great landmarks of the universe are fixed, that the stars and the planets are constants in an unchanging void. But the rings of Saturn prove that even the most iconic features of our solar system can be sudden and short-lived. We are living through a golden age of observation, catching a glimpse of a crown that is slowly slipping. The rings are a reminder that the universe does not build things to last. It builds things to change. The data from Icarus and the legacy of the Cassini mission have stripped away the illusion of permanence. We no longer see a static ring of ice, but a falling river. We see a system that is leaking, a crown that is evaporating into the clouds of the gas giant below. The rings are a fleeting whisper of ice in a vacuum of darkness, a momentary alignment of gravity and matter that will one day be gone. To understand this youth, we must move closer to the ice. We drift now from the distant observation of the golden sphere and glide directly into the ring plane. As we descend, the illusion of a solid, shimmering disk dissolves. What looked like a polished mirror from a billion miles away reveals itself to be a chaotic river of matter. This is not a single structure, but a swarm of billions of individual water-ice crystals, each orbiting the planet in a precise, invisible dance. Around us, the scale of these fragments varies with a jarring randomness. We float past grains of ice no larger than a speck of household dust, shimmering like microscopic diamonds in the sunlight. Then the void opens to reveal boulders the size of suburban houses, jagged monoliths of frozen water that have spent millions of years colliding and grinding against one another. There is no wind here, no sound, only the silent, relentless momentum of a trillion pieces of ice moving at kilometers per second. As we move deeper into the swarm, the most unsettling realization emerges. The rings are nearly transparent. Despite their vast width, they possess almost no depth. In certain regions, the entire structure is thinner than a single sheet of paper. We are moving through a veil that is thousands of kilometers wide, yet so thin that it defies the very concept of a physical object. It is a ghost of a disk, a translucent sheet of ice suspended in the absolute black of the vacuum. The light of the distant sun filters through this thinness, creating a soft, diffused glow that masks the emptiness. We see the rings not as a wall, but as a mist. The density is so low in some sections that you could drift through miles of the ring plane and encounter nothing but a few stray crystals of ice. It is a paradox of geometry. We are witnessing a structure that dominates the skyline of the solar system, yet it is so fragile that a slight shift in gravitational pull could scatter it into the void. The sheer geometry of this place defies human intuition. To grasp the physical impossibility of this place, we must translate these cosmic numbers into a language the human mind can actually hold. If the ring system were a city, it would be a metropolis of terrifying proportions, spanning 282,000 kilometers from one edge to the other. This distance is not merely large, it is roughly 70% of the total distance from the Earth to the Moon. If you were to travel across the width of the rings at the speed of a commercial jet, it would take you several days of nonstop flight just to cross the disk. But as we drift vertically, the horror of the scale reveals itself in the opposite direction. While the rings stretch across a vast continent of space, their average thickness is only 10 meters. 10 meters of ice suspended in a void of millions of kilometers. This is not a disk in any sense we understand on Earth. It is a geometric anomaly. The aspect ratio of the rings is one of the most extreme examples of flatness in the observable universe. It is a structure so thin that it ceases to feel like a physical object and begins to feel like a mathematical plane, a slice of two-dimensional space carved out of a three-dimensional vacuum. We are floating within a sliver of matter that is wider than that's the distance between worlds, yet thinner than a modest apartment building. This extreme flatness is a result of the relentless physics of the ring plane. Every single piece of ice, from the microscopic grain to the house-sized boulder, is being forced into a perfect, flat sheet by the crushing influence of Saturn's gravity and the centrifugal force of their orbit. Any fragment that dares to drift too far above or below the midline is quickly pulled back, colliding with billions of other particles until the energy of its vertical motion is bled away, flattening it back into the disk. This process of cosmic sanding has continued for millions of years, grinding the rings into a state of near-perfect equilibrium. The result is a shimmering, translucent sheet of water ice that possesses almost no volume compared to its surface area. When we look at the rings from a distance, they appear as solid, golden bands. But that is an illusion of perspective. We are seeing the edge of a blade. We are seeing a veil of ice so thin that it is practically invisible when viewed from the side. The light of the sun does not bounce off a solid surface, but filters through a cloud of frozen shards, creating a soft, ethereal glow that masks the terrifying emptiness between the particles. The scale here is a lesson in contrast. On one hand, we have the sprawling width of the system, a domain that could swallow entire planetary systems. On the other, we have a thickness that is almost negligible, a fragile layer of ice that seems as though it could be blown away by a cosmic breeze. It is a structure of impossible proportions, a silver sliver of light hanging in the absolute dark. This geometry is so precise, so unnervingly flat, that it challenges our understanding of how matter behaves on a planetary scale. We are drifting through a region of space where the very concept of depth has been erased, replaced by a shimmering two-dimensional river of ice. For eons, this impossible scale remained a secret, hidden by the vast distances of the outer solar system. We spent centuries guessing at the nature of the golden giant, seeing only a blur of light and shadow through primitive glass. We did not know that we were looking at the flattest structure in our neighborhood, or that the rings were a delicate balance of gravity and momentum. We saw a shape, but we did not see the scale. We saw a planet, but we did not see the veil. This impossible scale was first glimpsed by a single lens, and yet this shimmering veil was not always understood as a disk of ice. For most of human history, the golden giant was a blur of amber light, a distant point in the velvet black that defied explanation. The first real attempt to pierce this mystery happened in 1610, when Galileo Galilei turned his primitive telescope toward the heavens. He was looking for patterns, for the clockwork of the spheres, but what he found instead was a shape that broke every rule of planetary geometry. Through his lens, Saturn did not look like a sphere. It looked distorted. It looked broken. Expectation, a perfect sphere of gas. Reality, a planet with appendages. Galileo described what he saw as ears. He saw two smaller stationary companion planets flanking the central mass, clinging to the sides of the giant like silent sentinels. He could not see the rings, as we see them now, because his telescope lacked the resolution to resolve the gap between the planet and the disk. To Galileo, the universe was playing a trick of perspective. He spent years trying to reconcile this image with the laws of physics, wondering why these two companion bodies did not orbit the planet or drift away into the void. He was seeing the rings, but he was seeing them through a veil of optical limitation, turning a single flat disk into a fragmented trio of worlds. This lack of clarity created a mystery that lasted for a century and a half. For 150 years, the true shape of Saturn remained an enigma, a riddle written in light that no one could quite solve. Other astronomers tried to replicate Galileo's findings, some seeing the ears disappear, others seeing them merge back into the body of the planet. It was a cosmic disappearing act, driven by the simple fact that the rings are so thin that when they are tilted edge-on toward Earth, they vanish. The world was watching a crown that flickered in and out of existence, leaving the greatest minds of the era to argue over whether Saturn was a triple planet or a single world with an impossible anatomy. The tension of this mystery resided in the gap, that tiny dark sliver of emptiness between the cloud tops of the planet and the inner edge of the rings is what Galileo's lens could not capture. Without that gap, the rings merged with the planet, creating the illusion of solid attachments. It took the evolution of optics, the grinding of finer glass, and the patience of generations to realize that the ears were not moons, and the companions were not planets. They were seeing a structure that defied the very definition of a celestial body, a river of ice suspended in a perfect, fragile equilibrium. We can almost feel the frustration of those early observers, staring through tubes of lead and glass, trying to make sense of a shape that should not exist. They were witnessing the first hints of the impossible scale we now know, but they lacked the tools to measure the void. They were guessing at the architecture of a giant, unaware that they were looking at a structure so thin it was practically invisible. Every observation was a battle against the limits of light and glass, a slow realization that the universe is often far stranger than the images we first capture. The shift from Galileo's ears to a true ring system was not a sudden revelation, but a slow unfolding of truth. It required a leap in understanding, moving from the idea of solid companions to the concept of a fragmented disk. The mystery of the shape was the first clue that Saturn was not just another planet, but a unique anomaly in the solar system, a world wearing a crown of debris that challenged every existing map of the heavens. As we drift further from the era of primitive glass, the blurred lines of the 17th century sharpen into the high-definition reality of the modern age. The guesswork of the Renaissance gives way to the precision of the space age, where we no longer have to wonder about the shape of the giant. Modern instruments now see what Galileo could only guess, and yet the stillness of this frozen river is an illusion. As we drift closer to the golden sphere of the planet, the silence of the vacuum is broken by a violent, invisible current. For a long time, we viewed the rings as a stable architecture, a permanent fixture of the solar system that would endure as long as the planet itself. But the data gathered during the final daring orbits of the Cassini-Huygens mission in 2017 revealed a different truth. The rings are not merely sitting there, they are falling. Here is where the magnetic field of Saturn becomes an active predator. The planet is wrapped in a massive, swirling magnetosphere that does not simply shield the world, but actively reaches out into the ring plane. This field interacts with the tiny charged ice particles, stripping them away from their stable orbits and dragging them downward. Scientists describe this phenomenon as ring rain. It is a relentless, invisible storm of ice where billions of microscopic fragments are accelerated to immense speeds, plunging from the shimmering heights of the rings directly into the thick, hazy atmosphere of the giant below. We are witnessing a planetary consumption on a scale that defies our sense of permanence. The measurements are precise and cold. Saturn is consuming its own rings at a rate of 600 kilograms of ice per second. Every single second that passes, 600 kilograms of that shimmering silver veil vanish, dissolved into the depths of the gas giant. It is a slow-motion collapse, a steady leak of matter that is draining the crown of the king. If we could see the rings in the spectrum of these falling particles, they would not look like solid disks. They would look like a leaking faucet, a constant stream of frozen light pouring into the clouds. This process is not a sudden event, but a rhythmic erosion that has been occurring for millions of years. The ice that once formed part of a house-sized boulder or a shimmering crystal is now nothing more than a streak of plasma, burning up as it hits the upper atmosphere, filing the event into the deep record of space-time. The scale of this loss is difficult to grasp because the rings are so vast, but the math is unforgiving. When you calculate the total mass of the ring system against the rate of this rain, the conclusion is inevitable. The rings are temporary, they are a transient feature of the solar system, a brief flash of brilliance in the darkness. We have arrived at Saturn during a narrow window of cosmic time, catching a glimpse of a masterpiece just as it begins to fade. The beauty of the rings is not in their permanence, but in their fragility. They are a shimmering ghost, a structure that is being erased even as we observe it. The very forces that gave the rings their shape are now the forces that are dismantling them. The magnetic grip of the planet, the gravitational tug of the nearby moons, and the relentless pressure of the solar wind are all working in unison to reclaim the ice. As the rain continues, the gaps in the rings may widen, and the luminosity that makes Saturn the jewel of our solar system will slowly dim. We are drifting through a cemetery of ice, watching the slow descent of 1 trillion frozen fragments. This constant erosion makes the rings look like a ghost compared to other worlds, and yet the brilliance of this disappearing crown is not a universal trait among the giants. When we drift away from the golden glow of Saturn and look toward the further reaches of the outer solar system, the contrast becomes a lesson in cosmic chemistry. Jupiter, the largest of them all, possesses rings that are almost invisible to the naked eye. Its system is composed not of shimmering ice, but of dark microscopic dust. These are rings of debris, remnants of collisions, and volcanic eruptions from moons like Io, lacking the reflective power to cast a shadow across the planet's face. They are ghostly, muted, and thin, more like a smudge of charcoal against the deep velvet of the void than a structured monument. Further still, we find Uranus. The rings of Uranus are narrow, stark, and ink black. They do not glow, they absorb. They are composed of organic materials and dark minerals, acting as silhouettes that cut through the pale cyan light of the planet. In the cold silence of that distant orbit, the rings feel like charcoal lines drawn on a frozen sphere. They lack the luminosity, the scale, and the sheer architectural presence that defines the Saturnian system. Here is where the uniqueness of Saturn reveals itself. The reason these rings act as the jewel of the solar system is found in their composition. While other planets have rings of dust or rock, the measurements from the Cassini-Huygens mission confirmed a staggering fact. Saturn's rings are composed of 99.9% pure water ice. This is an almost impossible level of purity in a universe filled with cosmic dust and metallic ores. To see the rings is not to look at rock or soil, but to look into 1 trillion tiny floating mirrors. Each grain of ice, from the size of a snowflake to the size of a mountain, reflects the distant light of the sun with nearly perfect efficiency. This is why the rings appear as solid, shimmering sheets of silver and gold from a distance. They are not just structures of matter. They are light amplifiers. They take the dim, cold sunlight of the outer solar system and bounce it back into the void, creating a luminosity that dwarfs every other ring system in our neighborhood. The scale of this reflective power is what allows us to see the rings from billions of kilometers away. If the rings were made of the same dark carbon as those of Uranus or the silicates of Jupiter, Saturn would appear as a lonely, featureless ball of gas. Instead, we see a cosmic mirror, a vast array of frozen crystals that hold the light. This purity is an anomaly. In the chaos of planetary formation, where gravity pulls in everything from iron to methane, to have a structure of 99.9% pure ice suggests that the material did not come from a slow accumulation of cosmic dust. When you look at a mirror, you know it was manufactured, polished, and refined. When we look at the rings of Saturn, the purity of the ice suggests a similar kind of precision, though born of violence rather than a factory. The ice is too clean to be primordial. It is too pure to have survived the billions of years of radiation and debris. that define the early solar system. This purity is a fingerprint, a clue left behind by a specific catastrophic event. It tells us that the ice was once protected, perhaps hidden inside the core of a larger body, before being suddenly exposed to the vacuum of space. The shimmering light we see tonight is not a permanent feature of the cosmos, but a temporary reflection of a hidden history. The purity of the ice is the key to the mystery. It removes the possibility of a slow growth and points instead toward a sudden shattering emergence. This purity suggests a violent and sudden origin. The realization that these rings are vanishing transforms our perspective of the solar system from a static map into a living, breathing process of decay. We often view the cosmos as a gallery of eternal monuments, frozen in a state of timelessness, but the evidence suggests a more fragile truth. The rings of Saturn are not a permanent fixture of the planetary landscape. They are a passing shadow, a momentary arrangement of ice and gravity that is slowly being erased by the very forces that sustain it. This constant flux is the fundamental law of the deep cosmos. Everything that has a beginning must have an end, and the golden crown of Saturn is no exception. When we look at the rings tonight, we are witnessing a cosmic coincidence of staggering proportions. For the vast majority of the universe's history, Saturn was likely a lonely, featureless sphere of gas, drifting through the dark without its shimmering veil. And for the vast majority of its future, it will be the same. We happen to exist in the only window of human history where Saturn possesses its crown. Our ancestors, in the earliest days of the Pleistocene, looked up at a ringed world, and the humans of the distant future will look up at a void where those rings once were. We are the lucky observers of a brief, brilliant flash of existence. This fragility is echoed in the findings published in Nature Astronomy in 2019, which detailed the ephemeral nature of planetary rings. The study indicates that while other planets like Jupiter or Neptune have rings, they are often thin, dark, and transient. Saturn's rings are a singular anomaly of scale and luminosity, but that very brilliance makes their disappearance more profound. The rings are essentially a ghost in the making. As the magnetic fields continue to pull the ice downward in a relentless rain of particles, the structure grows thinner and more transparent. The river of frozen light is leaking into the clouds below, 1 kilogram at a time. If we could accelerate time, we would see the rings begin to blur. The sharp edges of the Encke gap would soften. The bright divisions would merge into a gray haze. Eventually, the reflective power that allows us to see Saturn from billions of kilometers away would fade. The mirror would shatter. The pure water ice, once a shield of luminosity, would be fully absorbed into the atmosphere of the giant, leaving behind a world that looks like any other gas giant in the cold dark of the outer rim. The monument we admire tonight is a temporary installation, a piece of cosmic art that is being dismantled in real time. This process reminds us that the scale of the universe is not just about distance, but about time. We measure the rings in hundreds of thousands of kilometers, but we should be measuring them in the fleeting millions of years they have existed. Compared to the 13 billion years of the observable universe, the lifespan of Saturn's rings is a heartbeat, a flicker, a single breath in the silence of the void. To call them permanent is to misunderstand the nature of gravity and entropy. The universe does not build monuments. It creates patterns that eventually dissolve. The rings are a reminder that we are drifting through a universe of transitions. The ice we see is not a relic of the beginning, but a fragment of a middle. We are standing in the center of a story that is still being written, watching a crown that is slowly slipping. The sheer improbability of our timing is what gives this view its value. We are here now at the exact moment when the light is strongest, before the rain claims the last of the ice, and yet the exact cause of this creation remains hidden. The origin of this shimmering river remains one of the most contested debates in planetary science. For years, we have looked at the purity of the ice and wondered where such a colossal amount of frozen water could have come from. One theory suggests the rings are the remains of a captured comet, a wanderer from the Oort cloud that ventured too close to the golden giant and was torn apart by the sheer force of gravity. Another possibility is that a moon, perhaps a world of ice and rock similar to Enceladus, drifted too far inward. This process is governed by a mathematical boundary known as the Roche limit. It is the invisible line in space where the tidal forces of a planet become stronger than the internal gravity holding a moon together. When a celestial body crosses the Roche limit, it no longer exists as a single object. The planet's gravity pulls harder on the near side of the moon than on the far side, stretching the world into an oval before snapping it into a billion fragments. The moon does not simply crash, it is shredded, its guts spilled across the orbital plane to create a flat, revolving disk of debris. The Roche limit explains the mechanism of the destruction, but it does not explain the timing. If the rings were created by a shredded moon, did this happen 4 billion years ago or only a few million? The conflict persists because the rings are so clean. Over eons, the rings should have collected dust and micrometeoroids, turning the bright ice into a dark, soot-covered gray. Yet, as the data confirms, the rings remain strikingly luminous. This suggests the event that created them happened recently, perhaps while mammals were first beginning to evolve on Earth. To resolve this, upcoming NASA-funded studies on ring dynamics are analyzing the precise gravitational wobbles of the ring particles. By mapping the way the ice interacts with Saturn's magnetic field and the tug of nearby moons, researchers hope to find the chemical fingerprint of the original parent body. They are looking for a specific ratio of isotopes that would distinguish a deep space comet from a native moon of the Saturnian system. Until those measurements are finalized, we are left with a mystery of timing and violence. We see the aftermath of a cosmic accident, a wreckage of a world that once had its own horizons, now reduced to a thin veil of light. It is a reminder that in the cold reaches of the outer solar system, stability is an illusion. Even the largest moons are subject to the hunger of the gravity well, waiting for the moment they stray a few thousand kilometers too close to the edge. And yet, while the rings are falling, there is another ghost haunting the orbit of the golden giant. To understand the true scale of Saturn is to realize that the rings are not a single solid sheet of light, but a chaotic zoo of objects that do not fit into the old map. Where we once imagined a smooth, uniform disk of frozen dust, the truth is a fragmented architecture of gaps and wakes where invisible shepherds carve canyons into the ice. Here is where you come in, drifting through the empty gap. This is a corridor of emptiness, a void carved into the ring by a tiny moon-sized shepherd. The 1980 and 1981 data from Voyager 1 and 2 first hinted at these irregularities, but it was the subsequent, more detailed mapping that revealed the terrifying precision of these boundaries. The gaps are not random. They are the result of orbital resonances, a cosmic symphony where the gravity of distant moons pulls at the ring particles, clearing the path with a mathematical cruelty. Imagine the rings not as a disk, but as a record player. Every gap, every ripple, and every density wave is a groove etched into the ice by the gravity of the moons. The rings are recording the history of every interaction the planet has ever had. These structures are not static. They shift, they breathe, and they warp. This fragile architecture is held together by a magnetic field that acts like a ghost hand. The Journal of Geophysical Research describes how Saturn's magnetosphere interacts with the ice, charging the particles and creating an invisible web that keeps the rings from collapsing instantly. It is a delicate balance of forces, a whisper of energy that prevents the ice from simply drifting into the dark. But as the measurements emerge, we see that even this balance is failing. The ring rain is not just a drizzle, it is a systemic collapse. The shepherd moons are losing their grip. The gaps are widening. The very structure that defines the identity of the planet is unraveling in a slow, silent surrender to the laws of entropy. The rings are not a monument to the planet's power, but a reminder of its hunger. Saturn is not protecting its crown. It is slowly eating it. The golden light of the gas giant now recedes, becoming a small amber spark against the absolute black of the outer solar system. We leave behind the river of ice and the ghost of a shredded moon, moving further into the stillness where the warmth of the sun is nothing more than a distant, cold memory. This journey through the rings of Saturn has shown us that the most permanent monuments of our sky are often the most fragile, existing only for a heartbeat in the life of a galaxy. We have seen how the Roche limit can turn a world into a veil, and how the rain of ice slowly erases the evidence of that violence, single grain by single grain. As we drift away, the silence of the vacuum deepens, absorbing the last echoes of the Saturnian system. The shimmering horizons of gold and silver vanish, replaced by the heavy velvet dark of the void. There is a profound peace in this scale, a realization that we are witnesses to a fleeting cosmic coincidence. We arrived at the right moment in the narrow window of time before the crown of the giant falls completely, leaving a naked planet to wander the darkness alone. The distance now grows until the planet is gone, and the rings are gone, and there is only the rhythmic, slow pulse of the deep cosmos. We are no longer observers of a world, but travelers in the emptiness between worlds, where time ceases to be a sequence of days and becomes a vast, unchanging ocean. The cold is absolute. The darkness is total. The noise of the world has faded into a whisper, and the whisper has faded into nothing. Everything we have seen, the house-sized boulders, the crystalline rivers, the violent shredding of moons, is now behind us, filed away in the archives of space-time. We move now toward the edge of the observable, where the light of a trillion stars blends into a single soft glow. The tension of discovery releases, leaving only the weightless drift of a mind returning to rest. If a crown as magnificent as Saturn's can vanish in the blink of a cosmic eye, what other illusions of permanence are we clinging to in the silence of the dark? If the rings were born while the Earth was still young and strange, what will be left of our own shimmering traces when the next great cycle begins? Sleep well tonight, and tomorrow we will continue to explore the deepest mysteries of the cosmos. Subscribe to Drift with us again.